All right, welcome everybody to Freightonomics. Today's show with me and Anthony Smith. Zach Strickland here, Director of Freight Market Intelligence here at Freightways. Anthony Smith, Chief Economist, here to discuss what's going on in the freight market and the overall economy. But we also today have a special guest that I'm very excited to introduce. Flew in almost fresh off the plane here before we dive into things. But Anthony, first, do you want to introduce, are you watching LinkedIn?
Oh yeah, so I'm going to be watching LinkedIn. So if I'm looking down, I'm not being rude or that rude intentionally. I'm going to be looking at LinkedIn. So if you have any questions, you want to jump into the conversation, you want to add to it, just feel free to chime in right here on LinkedIn. So I'm going to be watching that one, monitoring, send you a little shout out, join the show.
Yeah, and yes, me and Anthony didn't just decide we needed to get closer. For those of you that are normally used to watching us kind of spread apart here, we've got a special guest, Parker McNamara from Project 44. I'm very excited to have him on the show today to kind of discuss, one, what it is that Project 44 does, and number two, what do you do and what do you see? So let's get started with, so tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement in Project 44.
Absolutely. Zach, Anthony, thank you for welcoming me on the show. A bit of a last-second addition here, so I appreciate the accommodation. I'm an RVP of Sales at Project 44. For those unfamiliar with Project 44, we're the world's largest advanced visibility platform. So simply put, real-time tracking across all of your transportation shipments at the order and inventory level. I've been with the company for about 4.5 years. So I've been fortunate to see a lot of growth in the visibility space, a lot of adoption of technology within logistics, but also been a part of what we've seen these past 24 months, which there's been a lot of shifts in the market. So it's been exciting, and I appreciate you guys having me on here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I know, like I said, last second here, just flying in. We appreciate you making the time and jumping on. I mean, you've been with Project 44 for over 4 years now. You've seen quite a bit of the market. I mean, you've seen the different shifts. There's trends, there's boom cycles, there's down cycles. What's been one of the interesting things that you've seen happen over like the last year or so? I mean, it makes sense that we have this awesome partnership because at Freightwaves, one of the things that Craig really brought up here was transparency. Project 44 is bringing that transparency in a very amazing way in the maritime and when you look at international side. So what's been one of the things that you've seen really honed in on over the last year or so within the industry?
Yeah, it's been interesting, right? If we wind it back about a year, everyone was just trying to figure out from a visibility standpoint. A lot of what Project 44 does is drive predictability into your supply chain. So as they're starting to look at, okay, there's all of a sudden these disruptions, the news around the Port of LA is starting to come out. It was kind of panic mode, right? Yeah. So everybody's coming, hey, how can you help fix this? How could I have known that this was coming? I think as we're starting to progress over the last 12 months, what I'm starting to see in the market more than anything is almost this like comfortability to disruption that's starting to occur. Even like when I talk to customers and they ask me, hey, what's gonna be the ocean transit times? What's gonna be taking place in the trucking market? I think they're starting to be more comfortable with like these are gonna be short cycles and they're gonna be very violent over the next 12 to 24 months. And we're starting to set those expectations back at the board level of, hey, we don't really know. Right? There's some data providers out there. There's the Freightwaves, there's Project 44. That's going to give us some inclination, hopefully give us a little bit more runway into when these disruptions are coming. But the reality is, these are here to stay. And I think if it's not port congestion, then it's going to be the port slowdowns, or of course we got what's happening in the domestic truckload market right now. These trends are not going away, and I think we're starting to see the market start to actually adopt that and say, okay, how can we create a little bit of resiliency to be prepared for the next massive disruption where my CEO is going to call me and say, what are we doing about X, Y, Z? So it's been an interesting shift.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's kind of like we were lulled to sleep almost. And I know you had a little bit of experience prior to the, going to Project 44. You were recruiting in the brokerage sector, the 3PL sector for a while. So you definitely know that the market wasn't necessarily as volatile as it is today. And I think a lot of strategies and supply chain management strategies actually were built off of that stable period of time. Yeah. Are you starting to see a lot of people kind of accept like what you're talking about here in terms of, we're not going to go back to 2010, or do you think there's still some people holding on to that post-recession mentality?
Yeah, you typically see two schools of thought, right? Yeah. The first is like, okay, everything we did before 2000, let's call it 20, let's just throw it away, right? Like let's restart with systems, with assumptions, with expectations. And so you see those people who are really plugging in some of these new data sets into existing systems, right? New transit times, new ETAs, and how are we using that from a planning and execution standpoint? I would say on the other side, you kind of have the other school of thought, which is we're going to double down, right? Like we've already made these investments in these technologies. Like I'm not going to admit defeat here. I'm going to continue to kind of will my way until the markets resume to be a little bit back down to earth. So we'll see, right? Obviously, I think the three of us favor one school of thought there, and certainly believe the results from that will be fairly exponential in the years to come. But that's typically kind of what you see. There's rarely in the middle where it's kind of like, hey, maybe we blend a couple technologies. It's usually fresh start, I'm ready to go, or we're still kind of in that old school.
So Parker, a little bit of a question here on LinkedIn real quick.
Okay, we're getting live questions.
Yeah, getting live questions real
Yeah.
quick. So when we're looking at Project 44 itself as a platform, does it integrate with other platforms? Does it stand alone? Does it work with TMS? Things like that?
That's a great question. So we're really a system agnostic platform. So at our core, we're a data service. And so we have native integrations into over 55 of the largest TMS providers in the world. So it's essentially a turnkey turning on our data. And there it is, real-time shipment visibility across your entire supply chain. But then also proprietary systems. We have a many-to-one API connection platform. So we really look at ourselves as the connective tissue within supply chain, where you integrate with us in a single system of record, and we're going to integrate into all of your capacity partners, regardless of mode of transportation or geography, to give that normalized data into your system.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's a lot. And so, you guys obviously have a lot of visibility around the ports and the imports and everything there. We actually have some of your data inside of Sonar. Thank you for that. It's very useful.
It's a good partnership.
Yeah. So I guess my next question, and I know you've got limited time here before we go, is are you seeing any kind of significant divergence or changes on that maritime side yet? Or are we starting to see some of the similar things happen that we're seeing in the domestic truckload side translate upstream a little bit?
We are. So we're seeing a little bit more stabilization, certainly on the international shipping side. Now, a little bit more compared to what we experienced in the past year is saying very little. I do think we're probably going to see a similar slight decline in terms of just total shipping volume as we do move away from peak season and all this inventory finally gets to the DCs that have been these POs from months and months and months ago. Right, we went through the cycle where no chief supply chain officer could have enough inventory, right? It was like, it doesn't matter, like just cut the purchase order, like let's get this over here. And I think we are gonna see that inventory make their way to the shelves, which will cause an eventual, a little bit of a slowdown there. Hopefully, of course, the timing of that will align with, some seasonality pickups though.
So Parker, I know you have to go, but I want to keep talking to you.
No, I'm here. I welcome you guys. Welcome me here. So
I also have a follow-up question because inventory is an awesome topic right now. We're looking at inventories. We chat with Dr. Zach Rogers over at Colorado State. That's really a huge, I think, what is it, the 800-pound gorilla in the corner of the room that no one wants to talk about? It's been piling up. Do you see this as being like a really concerning trend moving forward, or is it something that we can really kind of work ourselves through as we continue to kind of progress through this maybe waning goods market in the upcoming months here?
Yeah, so those are a lot of the conversations we're having with customers, right? Is how can we use this data to optimize inventory? Of course, visibility can provide lots of ROI at like a tactical level, but as you start getting more and more strategic, it's how do we drive customer experience by having the right inventory? But then also how are we reducing waste and how are we reducing some of that safety stock and bloat? And I think what we're seeing here is because everybody just went through this cycle of buying as much as they could, they kind of updated the lead times into their planning systems to be these really long lead times. As those start to compress, if you're not plugging in dynamic lead times of what's actually happening in the market for the past 6 months, what are we projecting in the next 6 months, you're going to be stuck with that excess safety stock. And it's going to cause lots of expense in terms of these warehouses are going to fill, D&D at the ports, it's going to be expensive.
Amen to that. Yeah, we talked to Dr. Zach Rogers about inventory costs being through the roof. Inventory management. If you're managing inventory this year, you've
got a tough job. That's right.
God bless you. There's a lot to that. And I think we'll probably, it's this ebb and flow cycle that we're in right now. Well, thank you so much for jumping on the show, and give everybody a place they can reach out if they want to find out more about Project 44 or
absolutely. So 2 things. One, follow us on LinkedIn. always producing new content in terms of what we're bringing to the market, what we're seeing in the market. We share a lot of the data that we collect for free. So, oftentimes you can just see what we're sharing around the ports. And then the other piece is, on our website, if you want to learn more, if you want to continue this conversation, I welcome it with any of the listeners here. Certainly, as you can tell, I love talking about it. So feel free to reach out to us via our website. I'll make sure it's connected to me directly, and we can keep this going.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Parker.
Thank you, guys.
Enjoy the rest of your trip.
Yeah, that's right. I appreciate it.
All right, man.
All right, take care.
Appreciate it. Well, Anthony, the market, I love hearing about like these other like participants. At FreightWaves, we have a lot of internal information and knowledge here, but it's not necessarily, I like having some of that external experience.
And I mean, it's part of what we're talking about. I know even just this morning was talking about all the different moving pieces. There are so many different moving segments.
Well, even the maritime sector is moving independently of the domestic truckload, but some of that is connected, and anything that happens upstream affects the downstream. And I think that's something that we have to be mindful of. Speaking of
extremes,
and extremes, we have a clip. Dr. Zach Rogers here, Anthony. If you want to set it up,
that's right.
Tell us what we got.
Dr. Zach Rogers over at Colorado State University really heads up the Logistics Managers Index. If you haven't been taking note of it, been watching it, please do yourself a favor, read it, get involved in some of the reports. I think Dr. Zach Rogers is one of the most underrated voices in the supply chain. He usually joins us here on Freightonomics from time to time, but couldn't be live because
he teaches.
He's busy teaching,
doing works.
His day job.
What do you know?
But he was kind enough to provide us some of the top things to note in this latest edition of the LMI. We have it queued up right here.
Hey guys, it's great to see you totally live. So today I wanted to talk about what we found in the report, and this is a really interesting report because I think we're starting to see maybe we're getting close, or maybe we've now hit kind of the top of the crazy logistics costs and stresses that we've seen over the last 18 months, really 2 years, but the last 18 months has been really, really intense. And there's a couple different ways that we kind of see this manifesting in this month's report. So the first graph I have for you here is the overall index, and you can see we moved up a point from 75.2 to 76.2. 76.2 is the highest that we've ever been in the 6 years we've been doing this. So it's the fastest rate of overall expansion that we've seen for the LMI in 6 years. And if you look at just like Q1 of 2022, because now we're at the end of Q1 for 2022, the average has been a 74.5, which would have been, like the three very, very high readings. And it's mostly being fueled right now by two things. One is absolute lack of warehousing capacity. It's at a 36 right now, which is also the lowest that's ever been. So the greatest rate of contraction we've ever seen in the warehousing space. And that's a lot due to really high inventory levels. Our two highest ratings we've ever had have been the last 2 months as we sort of built up all of this mass that came in late during Christmas. Plus, at the same time, I think we also see some retailers pulling stuff forward because they're worried about the dock stuff in July, the dock workers contract expiring. And if you remember, in 2015, that caused a big slowdown, and I think people are really trying to avoid that as much as possible. And maybe now would be a good time when there's a little bit of a lull relatively at the port. So we're pulling a lot of inventory forward. At the same time, consumers are not spending quite as much money on goods as they were before, partly because now there's services available. You can go to grandma's house, you can go to movies, you can go to baseball games maybe in a couple weeks. Things are kind of opening up, and so we're not spending as much money on services. Plus, the money we are spending on services isn't going as far, and that's because inflation was up, 7.9%, 7.8% in February. It's going to be up quite a bit in March as well. We saw it was bigger in the Eurozone in March and February. Wouldn't be surprised to see that here in the U.S. And so that adds up to this graph right here, which is our aggregate logistics price. And so aggregate logistics price, you can see, is a combination metric of warehousing price, transportation price, and inventory cost. So 271.3, which is our highest by 0.2, just above where we were in November. And so supply chains have never been more expensive than they are right now in terms of cost growth. in March because of all of this inventory in the system. Now, this is a different 271 than the one we saw in November, and here's why. In November, it was really driven by transportation, and now it's driven more by all the stuff that's stuck in supply chains, which in some ways is not quite as ideal, I don't think, because what it shows is where the costs were really high in November because everything was moving dynamically as fast as it could. The costs are high now because everything is stuck. And some evidence of sort of the ramifications of everything being stuck, as well as these crazy diesel fuel costs we've seen, are in this next picture here. And so if you look, we broke out a couple different, we sliced the data up a couple different ways. We looked at upstream versus downstream. So upstream is your manufacturers, wholesalers, 3PLs, things like that. Downstream is primarily retailers. And we looked at early March, so March 1st to the 15th, versus late March, which is the 16th to the 31st. And I think we see really interesting numbers here, especially if you hone in on that transportation capacity, which is that middle graph there. So the green bar is upstream in the first half of March. There's a 40. That's about, you know, the level of contraction with capacity we've been seeing. If we go forward, though, to the second half of March, suddenly it's a 55, right? So we move 15 points. We move from pretty steady to contraction to actually fairly mild rates of expansion. And that expansion is the first expansion we've seen in 18 months. If you take all of this together as a whole, just all of upstream, putting the first and second half of March together, it's a 50, which is neutral. And again, we haven't been at neutral. We haven't been anything other than contraction since, I think, June of 2020 for transportation, and I think August of 2020 for warehousing. So this is really, really kind of a shift we're seeing in the back half of March, that suddenly there's some slack in capacity. We saw the same movement downstream. We went from a 31 to a 45. The difference is we were so far down downstream that we couldn't quite get up to growth. Okay, so we saw these big movements. The last piece I want to take a look at here is price. You can see price, the rate of growth went down from 94, which is a absolutely scorching rate of growth, to 84 for upstream firms. Now 84 is still a very healthy rate of growth, but it's 10 points lower. It's statistically significantly lower when you look at it with the t-test than what we saw in the first half of March. Downstream was lower as well, but only 5 points. There was no statistical significance there. But I think it's interesting. And it's interesting because we've always kind of known, and Zach, you wrote this the other day in your chart of the week, the pace we've been going at was unsustainable. There was no way we could keep going at this pace. And it was sort of a question of, okay, well, when will we start to turn the corner? It seems like possibly the combination of we have way too much inventory on hand, consumer dollars aren't going as far, and those diesel costs, that $5.15 for diesel or whatever it was, I think that's what it was at this Monday, that is finally getting us to the point where these costs are so high, consumers can't absorb the high costs like they did in 2021, and now maybe we have to do something else. Now, I don't know that this would lead to a full-on recession because we're starting from so high that we have some slack, right? We have some slack, and actually getting some slack in the transportation and freight markets might not be the worst thing in the world. And so it really, the interesting question now is, because we're turning, we are turning, it seems very clear. The interesting question now is, are we turning too far where we're going to veer into a freight recession, or are we turning to the place where we're sort of normalizing and hitting that market equilibrium that we've been chasing for the last 18 months?
Oh man, so really great insight from Dr. Zach Rogers. And I kind of want to hone in on the last thing that he just said. And now if our guys in the back can queue up a chart for me, I want to queue up the used truck prices first, because he's talking about, are we swinging violently one direction or the other? So this is the used truck price. We talked about it this morning on FreightWaves Now. And to me, he's kind of he's stopping short of saying it's still too early to say freight recession, et cetera. Well, looking at this chart, and correct me if I'm wrong on my physics, because I'm a little bit shaky. looking at this chart, you've got the outbound tender rejection index in the green line. It's plummeting. You've got the used truck price for 3 years. Just exponential increase still. So this is this chart is basically illustrating cost versus capacity.
Yeah.
And that circle there that you see, that's the last transition that we had. That was that 2019 year where truck prices actually stayed elevated through or late, like much further deeper into after the cycle had already turned. So this to me is like inflation I think it's a little extreme.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see this market turn rapidly, and I think it's going to be violent, and I think it's going to be one of those situations just because of the sheer weight of what I'm looking at in these charts is just so big. Like the pendulum swings back as hard as it swings forward.
Yeah.
I just feel like we got a long way to go. Your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, you brought this chart up. I know we're talking about it on FreightWaves Now earlier this morning, and I thought it was an amazing, brilliant takeaway because you look at how high those used truck prices are, and they're still elevated with rates coming down, spot rates coming down. Like you said, they're going to have to be under these used truck prices. It's going to be a burden that they're going to have to carry for a longer amount of time for more carriers with lower rates, especially if you're a new entrant into the market. So when I look at this, it tells, I think, a great story. I love the circle around it because I think when you tie it all together, it really shows the amount of pain that a lot of folks might start feeling, that they're already feeling, but it's going to be extended because when you look at how many people are going to be under these used truck prices, those smaller operations, compared to those larger carriers. The other great point that you brought up was competition within it.
Yep.
When you have different competing, I think that's a huge point in this because when you have that competition, that's not going to be able to be had with some of those smaller competitors, which is going to provide the same
truck
service.
Prices. So most of the time, the 3-year models go to these smaller fleets because they don't have the buying power with the OEMs. But again, the used truck prices are just a good way. You know, you normally don't. Back in the day, the logic was you don't want to take that depreciation. And now you're paying as much for a used truck as you did for a new truck, and especially these smaller fleets, owner-operator level. And with capacity easing, is that going to deflate rates? And a lot of these carriers, these smaller fleets, have a dependency on the spot market that these larger fleets do not, because they have these contracts with these larger shippers. And so this is, that chart was it stood out to me. Now, Craig Fuller kind of touches on this on his most recent article as well, talking about breaking down operating expenses tied to trucking, bloodbath, et cetera. Like he's been on a tear lately. Some people have basically accused him of busting the market, but I'm like, he's got data behind him. Like what we're looking at is not something that we're trying to validate at this point. So I want to pull up another chart real quickly to kind of illustrate. This is going to be the fuel costs chart. And it's going to help illustrate what he's talking about here in terms of inflationary pressure. Zach Rogers talked about fuel costs and fuel prices. This is the gross fuel expense as a percent of total revenue for the dry van consolidated in the blue line. And you can see that it's hovering around 18, 19%. It's been going up to start the year, but that's through February. This is the TCA data, the Truckload Carriers Association data that measures mainly mid to small size fleets. And this is their percent of fuel cost that they have, gross fuel expense. You look at the orange line right there, that's the average retail price of fuel for the United States. And you can see that most of that jump occurs in March. I'm going to be interested to see what happens come April when we see the updated data here.
Yeah, and I think even bringing it back to Dr. Zach Rogers, who just had the LMI, one of the great points that he had in there was that the beginning of March looked a lot different than the second half of March. And like you said, there's so many divergent trends that I'm looking forward to seeing. Probably not going to be excited about some of the results here. But like when we looked at, for example, just throwing one out there, personal consumption expenditures on durable goods got updated through February. February was showing some signs of softening in terms of volumes, but it was still pretty elevated.
This is all of this stuff has happened literally. We've called the date March 6th in all of our stuff. It almost like the whole market turned on one day.
And I mean, it's like March is just the month for events to happen here now. But when you look at that data, it just shows that we haven't even started to see some of the macroeconomic data catch up to what we're seeing in some of our proprietary stuff. We're looking at volumes right now. Those durable goods have fallen. And I mean, we saw, I think it was 2.5% downward movement on consumer spending for durable goods through February.
And that's adjusted for inflation.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. And so, I mean, when we look at that going into this next month, it's going to get real interesting. And of course, we got to see what Jerome Powell does with those interest rates as well.
Bump them up. He's going to bump them up, Anthony.
It's going to go up. It's going to go up.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for tuning in this week, and thank you so much to Parker for stopping by. Hopefully everybody at Project 44 is doing well. Anybody wants to come on the show, they can.
Yeah, come on over. I mean, drink more water. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to go to tv.foraves.com. Get signed up for Northwest Arkansas. We got an event coming up in a couple of weeks here, a few weeks.
About a month. See you soon.